Welcome back. We now have a front end running. So we have the front end running at localhost 3000 to dos, and we also have our backend API ready as well. So when I say localhost 8080, I get the response hello world. Let's start the journey to tie them up together. What we want to do is we would want to start with calling the hello world service. So what we want to do is we want to call the hello world service from, let's say, the welcome page. So over here what we'll do is we'll add a simple message and we'll add a button, and on the click of the button we would want to call the hello world service. Let's start with the preparation in this step. So let's add a piece of text and a button in here. Let's go to our favorite IDE, Visual Studio Code, and let's open up our welcome component. This is what we have in our welcome component right now. Let's tab this in a little bit and let's just put a enter here so that we can see everything which is present in here. Let's add another div. So I'll add another div container, and over here I'll add the text. Click here to get a customized welcome message. Let's not worry about the exact text. Some text, and over here I would want to add a button. And what we would want to do, we would want to call the hello world service. For now I'll just say retrieve welcome message, and this is present in this class, so I need to say this dot retrieve message, and I would want, this is JavaScript code, we would need to put it in braces. So that's what we'll do. And over here let's put the text get welcome message. Cool. Let's save this, go to our UI. This is what we see, get welcome message. I'll say class is equal to, actually class name is equal to button, and let's say button success. I'm having a little bit of problem with the CSS because whatever we put in the counter is actually causing a problem here. So let's go to the counter.css and actually disable some of the CSS which is present in here. I don't really want to worry about the CSS for now. So what I'll do is I'll comment out all the CSS which is present inside the counter.css. Ideally, what we should have done when we did the counter.css is use the class name of the counter app before each of these CSS elements, so that this CSS is only applicable to the counter element. But for now, let's just comment it out and let's go back to the page. Let's align it a little bit so that I can see all the text which is present in here. Now let's go ahead and define this retrieve welcome message method. So retrieve welcome message, and over here for now let's just do a console.log. Retrieve. Now will this work? Think about this. This is sufficient? No, we need to actually have a constructor, right? So let's add a constructor and do the binding. So constructor props as usual. We'll call the super of props. And after that, we would want to actually do this dot retrieve welcome message is equal to this dot retrieve welcome message dot bind. This cool. This is something which we must be very proficient by now. Now if I go there and if I do the get welcome message, retrieve click is out there. So what we did in this specific step until now is we actually added this message, we added the button, and we see retrieve clicked. What we actually want to do is we would want to call this service which is exposed from the backend. We would want to call localhost 8080 hello world, and we would want to see the response back and show it as a message down here. We'll focus on that in the next step. One of the things that I see here is a lot of warnings. So let's quickly get rid of all the warnings which are being highlighted in here. How do I get rid of the warnings? So error component is defined but not used. So let's open up the error component, Control P or Command P, error component, and what is not used is component. Let's get rid of it. The next thing is to do app. Let's go to do app. .jsx. What's the error? Link is defined but not used. Let's remove the link from here. The counter.jsx one is a little interesting. It says on line 59 uses constructor. I was actually coming here and looking at this, and I was confused. Oops, this constructor is used. But actually, it's talking about the that actually it's talking about the constructor in here. So this is kind of the default constructor which would be anyway provided. So even if I don't provide this, this would be actually provided by counter button. Earlier we had state in here, so we needed a constructor, but we don't really need it right now. So let's comment it out. So I'll take the manual root here, so /// and // I comment out the 3 lines. Now that's gone too. And app.js, control P, command P, app.js, and it says the counter is not really used. So let's comment that out. The next thing which we see is the learning components is defined but not used. And I go to the app.js, we have learning components down here. I can actually comment it out completely, and we can uncomment it when we want to come back, but once we do that, we get more errors about these components. So if I comment this out, finally, when I go through the pages, I see that I don't really have an error. So it's up to you whether you'd want to do this or not. I like having my console empty or without warnings so that we can actually focus on errors. Some of the times what would happen is when we have a lot of warnings in the console, you cannot see the real errors. And that's the reason why you need to always focus on the warnings, look at the console and see if there are warnings, and make sure that you address them whenever you can. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye-bye. Welcome back. We now have the welcome page ready. When we click at welcome message, what we want to do? We want to call the hello world. In this quick step, let's take a quick look at the framework we are going to use. The framework which we are going to use to make the HTTP call is called Axios. So if you do a Google search for Axios Promise HTTP client or Axios HTTP client, this should be the first link. It is github/axios/axios. So this is the link we are interested in. Once you open up that page, you would see that it's a promise-based HTTP client for the browser and Node. So basically what Axios allows us to do is to make HTTP calls. One of the most important things that Axios does is it's based on promises. So if you go further down and look at the features, then you can see that it supports something called the Promise API. It has a lot of other features where you can actually intercept requests and responses. You can actually transform the data which comes back from the services. You can cancel requests and stuff like that. But let's start with looking at the Promise API. So if you click this link down here and go here, you'd go to the developer Mozilla site where an introduction to what is a promise is provided. One of the important things to understand is when I click this button and when we are calling the service might take a long time to respond. And if we keep waiting for the service to respond, this entire browser would be hanging. That's why we don't want to make a synchronous call. We want to make a asynchronous call. So all the HTTP calls that we make typically from a front end would be done using a asynchronous framework. That means you just call the service and continue doing the processing. And when the response comes back from the service, you take the response and update the screen based on it. You don't keep waiting for the response to come back. And promises help us to do simple asynchronous operations. With a promise, what you can do is don't worry about the syntax used to create the promise in here. That might look a little complex for somebody who's starting off. But the most important thing with a promise is you can define once the promise is completed, once I have the response back, or once something is completed, what we can do is then execute this function based on the response. If you look at this promise returns a value called foo. One of the things this is doing is actually setting a timeout. This is kind of doing an asynchronous operation where we are waiting for 300 milliseconds and then returning foo back. What happens is over here we are defining when foo comes back, what should be done. We are logging the value of foo into the console, and after that we are executing the next line of code. So I'll add one more line to this. I'll say console.log and say done, and let's run this. You can see what is printed first. Done is printed first, then this promise object is printed, then only then this 300 milliseconds completed and this returned foo back, and only then this code got executed. So what we are doing in here is asynchronously call something. So we are saying make an asynchronous call, and we defined here what should be done when the asynchronous call comes back with a response. And then we continued execution. We saw that line 12 and line 13 output was printed first, and after that the asynchronous operation completed execution, and then once the response comes back we act on it and we print this into the console. Axios framework helps us to take the same concept and put it into use for calling HTTP APIs. If this is a little confusing, don't worry about it. When we make our first HTTP call, most of these things will be very clear to you. In this quick step, we looked at the Axios framework, which is basically a promise-based HTTP client. It allows us to make HTTP calls from our JavaScript code. We also took a quick look at what is a promise. We saw that promises allow us to define a asynchronous operation and also define what should be done when the asynchronous operation completes execution. We'll talk more about this in the subsequent steps. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye-bye. Welcome back. We have our server running on port 8080 and we have our React application running on 3000, which is kind of the default port where all React applications run at. One of the things which we want to do in 28 minutes is being able to build different backend APIs and connect them to different front-end frameworks. And to be able to do that, there is a need to standardize the ports which we use. What we'll do is we will standardize on port 8080 for the backend. However, for the front end, let's use a different port which is called 4200. So instead of running the application on localhost 3000, what we want to do is we would want to run the React application on localhost 4200. Whenever you build a backend, you need to tell where the request for it would be coming from. You need to tell the exact URI. Otherwise, it would not accept requests from the front end. Let's not really worry about it for now. For now, let's try and configure 4200. How do we configure it? It's easy. All that we need to do is go to our package.json, and over here in the start we can specify a port. So I'll say port is equal to 4200 and save, and you can go back to the place we are running it and stop it and do a npm start again. You'd see that now port 4200 is being used, and now you can see that the to-do application is being launched at localhost 4200. You can log in and you'd see that your functionality would remain exactly as it was earlier. So there are no real changes except for the fact that we are now using 4200, port 4200 to run the application. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye-bye. Welcome back. When we click the get welcome message, we would want to make a HTTP call using Axios. Now, how do I get the Axios framework into our project, and how do we make that call? That's what we will be looking at in this specific step. The first question, how do we get Axios framework into our framework? Think about it. You are right. We need to add it. So I'm going to terminate the run and I'll say npm add Axios and click enter. We should start adding the Axios dependency to our project to our package.json, and you'll also see that the Axios and its dependencies are downloaded. So let's go back to the Visual Studio Code and let's look at package.json. Right now, Axios is not really in here. If we wait for a little while, you'd see that it would be added in.